We at On the Way Home would like to acknowledge the original stewards of whose lands this podcast is recorded on. In York Region, we recognize we're on the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples, and that this is the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And in Vancouver, we acknowledge that we are on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, whose presence on these lands continue to this day.
Welcome to On the Way Home, a podcast dedicated to the issues surrounding homelessness and the incredible experts making a difference in the lives of homeless people. Remember to subscribe to the podcast anywhere you're listening and share it with a friend.
Welcome to On the Way Home. If you're looking for a different podcast, you're in the wrong space. But if you are interested in the best and the brightest, talking to me about housing, homelessness, justice, health, all these really, really cool things that make our world turn, you are in the right place. Every week on this podcast, On the Way Home, maybe you're listening to it on the way home or with a coffee, etc. You're going to learn a lot. I know I do. I've been in this field a long time, but every week I learn something new, and it's really, really cool. We have experts, and this podcast gives me a great deal of hope for the future because we're facing some massive challenges right now in the social services sector. But we are very hopeful because we have some brilliant people across Canada, around Ontario, in BC, on the East Coast, in the middle of Canada, in the prairies, and around the world as well. We've had guests as far as Australia, guests from Finland, where they have declared they've ended homelessness, which is really, really cool. And that was not a one-year task. It was over about 25 years. We've had guests from Norway and the U.S. It's very, very cool. So sit tight and listen in. But first, before we get to our amazing guest today, let me tell you a little bit about Blue Door, my organization. So Blue Door is an organization that is rooted in York Region. Our primary focus from the start was to prevent and end homelessness. But we've found as we've gone along, it's pretty complex, right? There's pieces around supporting our clients with health services that they might not have access to, in developing housing, and we'll talk a little bit more about that today, and as well, real employment opportunities. I say real employment opportunities that pay a living wage, that are meaningful, that actually lift people out of poverty. And we've learned not just to react to homelessness after it's already happened, but to think a little more upstream with brilliant people like Dr. Stephen Gates and Melanie Redmond from Away Home Canada and others who have had a huge focus on the prevention of homelessness. You can't end it if you don't prevent it from starting in the first place. So we do all that kind of work and focus on that in York Region. We've stretched our Construct program, our Construction Social Enterprise, into Durham and Peel, and have worked with amazing folks at the Home Depot Foundation Canada on a program called TradeWorks, where programs like Construction Social Enterprises, are supported. We come together to share resources across the country. So very, very cool stuff happening at Blue Door. And this podcast would not be possible without our friends at the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. They do great work, nationally leading work. They have something called the Built for Zero campaign. If you want to be a Built for Zero community, check out their website at caeh.ca. And really, they'll work with communities to try and get you to a functional zero, where people are not experiencing homelessness because you have enough services to support anyone who needs them. And it's a lot deeper than that. I'm not doing it justice. Check out their website. Get them out. They have brilliant people at the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. And they are putting on a massive conference in November. You can either go virtually, or for the first time in a couple of years, you can attend in person. This year it's in Toronto. They shifted all over Canada. It's the largest of its kind in this sector. They have some brilliant, brilliant speakers and workshops there. So check it out at caeh.ca. The earlier you register, if you register before August 12th, this podcast may or may not drop before then, but there's an early bird discount. But even then, afterwards, it's still very, very reasonable. And if you can't go in person, sign up virtually and pick the sessions you want to attend. So that's happening at the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. Today, we have a very special guest. I think if you've heard me talk before about some of our challenges in this sector, it is that lack of truly affordable housing. So rent geared to income. My team at Blue Door, our colleagues across the region, our colleagues across the country, many of our clients are on a very limited income. recently the Globe and Mail talked about if the threshold is 30% of your income to spend on housing, that's really the max you should spend. You would need a household income of $90,000 a year to afford a one-bedroom apartment. For many people in social assistance in Ontario, they have an income of $700 a month, or about $8,000 in total with all the supports a year. And if you're receiving ODSP, which is disability supports, that's about $13,000 a year. So you see there's a massive gap. So we have to be creative in this sector. We have to make sure we're securing more affordable housing, what we call maybe social purpose-built real estate, right, going forward. So today I have with me, and I've said it about 3 times with his last name, so I'm going to apologize to Matti right away. I'm Matti Siemiatycki. How was that, Matti? Is that good?
Perfect.
Oh, he gave me the thumb up. So we have Matti Siemiatycki. He's the director of Infrastructure Institute and the professor of geography and planning at U of T. His work focuses on delivering large-scale infrastructure projects, evidence-based infrastructure, and we've heard a lot about evidence really matters, folks, investment decisions, and effective integration of infrastructure into the fabric of cities. We're going to talk about that today, too. Matti consults widely on infrastructure policy, and we've also learned that housing, or lack of affordable housing, is a result of bad policy. Policy matters, folks. He consults on infrastructure policy and is a frequent media commentator on infrastructure and city planning. Matti, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Michael. It's great to be with you.
We ask same first question to every guest, and we get multiple different answers with some underlying themes that come through it. Matti, what does home mean to you?
Home means many different things. For me, at its base level, it's deeply emotional and it's deeply personal. I mean, home is the place that you can walk through in the dark because you know the spaces so well. You can get without stubbing your toe. It's the place where you can picture your loved ones or important moments of your life in that space. So on one level, it's deeply emotional. Then at another level, it's more than bricks and mortar. Home is also about relationships, and it's relationships inside the home, and home is also about community. And for many of us, when we think of our home, it's not just the building itself, it's everything around it. It's the neighbors, it's the spaces, the parks, but the people. It's really in the people and around them. And then finally, and I think this is the most challenging part in our current day and age, home has also been thought of as a financial asset. And it's very much part of people's financial portfolio and their financial health and picture. And so many people are also using their home as, in some cases, their lender as they borrow against their home, and in some cases as their retirement saving plan for those who own. And in cases of renting, people are feeling deep pressure as the price of rents go up. And they face issues like rent eviction. So home has also a very deep financial picture to it as well. So it's a complicated, the dynamic of what home means then is not simple. It's really multifaceted. And I think that's why this space has all these complicated elements.
Absolutely.
To it.
I love a lot of what you were saying there when you're talking about knowing it in the dark. It is that, and no one's ever used that before. It is that sense of the familiar, when I'm comfortable, that familiar. I love when you talk about community. If we looked at in 2017, Jesse Thistle and the Observatory on Homelessness put out an Indigenous definition of homelessness that spoke more about the relationship aspect of it and community and relationship to the land, etc. And I love what we've learned in the sector too. So we learn from doing things wrong, unfortunately sometimes, but we learn. Where we put people into housing and they'd be back at emergency shelter. And it's because we didn't help create that sense of community around them. They had community at the shelter, and then we put them in housing where they were isolated, alone. No one was asking questions. So that sense of what we've learned now is that we try and integrate them in. But that sense of community is huge into stabilizing housing. And lastly, what you're saying about housing as a commodity. Unfortunately, years and years ago, people wouldn't say, that wasn't really a main fixture as a commodity. A home was your kind of all those things you mentioned, and it has more and more through the financialization of housing become that commodity. And I was saying today on an earlier podcast where Canadians are almost ownership obsessed. If you don't own your home, there's a problem. And in most parts, or many parts of the world, it's just not, I mean, no one owns their home. They rent for life, and it's not they don't see that as the way forward, right? But some great themes in there, so thank you for sharing. Now, we are in housing. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I have so many thoughts on even just what you said. Like, you get me thinking about how we've planned communities over the years, and how we often, especially in rental communities, pictured them as being very transient, and so we would do redevelopments where planners and politicians would move people around, and not understand that it's not just the physical bricks and mortar of communities, but it's the ties that build up over years, and so the physical state of buildings may have worn down, but the community ties were very strong. And as those get dispersed, and as those weren't considered sufficiently, I mean, we really undermine the strength of networks and the strength of what made a pride of place. And I think we're learning a lot more, even as we start to do developments. Like, we're starting to learn, and as we start to focus on issues of homelessness, that it's the connections as well as the physical spaces that are really important to people. And I think that's, to me, seems like a critical theme in this sector. Is thinking holistically about what home is. So I'm really pleased that we're starting at that point, and maybe unpacking this. And the bricks and mortar have to be safe, and the building, the physical plant has to be maintained. There's no doubt about that. But we have to also think about this in a much more holistic way, and about the wraparound services that enable people to be successful.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's so funny when you talk about planning, and I think of good examples of that. Like, so you have where we didn't plan so much. Quite often it's when you say, all right, we're going to make this whole block. So you look at Regent Park as an example, right? You can't take all the units and make them deeply affordable social housing. You looked at a mixed, and then replanning that. And I again, planning's not my background, but I look at the replanning of that, all the different things they did to not make it housing, but make it a community, mixed income, a community center, different feel to it. And I think that's a good example of that. Can you think of are there other examples of good planning, and maybe you could share one that needs to be fixed?
We're learning each time we do this, and Regent Park, the redevelopment, has a contentious history, and I think and mixed reviews on what people say about it. But I think where it's been successful for me is the social infrastructure was built. And was built in a very serious way and at a high quality. So, you have a park at its core, you have the swimming pool, the Pam McConnell swimming pool, which is a stunning facility, and you have new parks facilities, you have Dixon Hall, which has a training center there. They really focused heavily on making sure that the social spaces are present, and then also the mix of housing, I think, is key. And what's critical then is, again, it's the bricks and mortar, and I think the next step is making sure that everyone feels comfortable in those spaces. And that's, I think there's ongoing work that's being done, and as the community develops, and as people settle and resettle, that work is happening, and those spaces are becoming lived in. They're turning from like development spaces to really community spaces, and you can see and feel it, and that's an ongoing process. And I think we've learned a lot more about how to do that, about how to make sure that people have the right to return and what that right of return actually means. We're now seeing projects with Alexandra Park or and some of the other ones that are happening across Lawrence Heights, some of the other ones that are happening across the region, where we're trying to learn, and it's we learn as we go, and they're not always perfect, and we get pushback. And I think that pushback is ideally when the system works, people learn from it and go to make it better. But I think what we're saying here is the element of community. It is so important, even as we're rebuilding these
absolutely
spaces.
You mentioned something else that I hadn't thought of until recently in talking to someone who's developing housing, and you mentioned the crumbling infrastructure. I was talking to Tim Richter recently. He said we actually have less affordable housing now than we did in 2015. He said, because we're building a lot, but we are losing it faster than we're building it. And so with this builder, when we talk about building and infrastructure, we're like, all right, you hear words like modular. We could get it up in half the time. It's a great build. It's really energy efficient, that kind of thing. We're reducing the carbon footprint. But what this group was talking about, they said, we're a little more costly up front, but we're building buildings that will last 80 years where you don't have to sink. Because many of us, just because of lack of resources in the social services, we are not planning to replace that building in 40 years or to have that money to do, to keep it up, as you said, so it's not crumbling, right? So we're not losing that. I never really thought of that until now, and I don't think many of us do it. We're a little more short-sighted, and we need housing, we need it now, and we need it as cheaply as possible.
It's really stunning when you think about it that way, that, between units coming out of TCHC as they've fallen into such disrepair that they can't be lived in, and that's happened, as well as units that were previously affordable in single room occupancy hotels and other types of housing being taken off of the rental market and for low income rental and rent evictions. I mean, we are absolutely losing that affordable housing that was kind of the bedrock. We are losing units, and it's really expensive to build new units. You're absolutely right about that. And the other piece of this is the operations and maintenance, and this is where I put my infrastructure hat on, because when you think about infrastructure like a subway or a bridge or a highway, like that has to be maintained every single year on year over year, so that it doesn't become unsafe and you don't have disasters. And sometimes with housing, we tend to focus on the upfront costs and then figure that like the operation and maintenance is going to kind of take care of itself, or it'll be done kind of just like as a natural right, and it doesn't work that way. And infrastructure, and just like with infrastructure, housing depreciates over time, and it needs constant awareness and constant upkeep. And without that, you will over time these buildings will fall into disrepair, and the infrastructure in them, the pipes and the boilers and the heaters and everything else will fail. And we're in a spot now where we haven't kept up. The governments haven't provided sufficient money, especially for the low income portfolios or the public housing portfolios. And we're actually losing units even as we're racing.
Well, not only are they crumbling, but you brought up something there. And like I said, I'm always learning on this podcast. We had a guest on from Ottawa, and she was talking that for every new build, we're losing 15 to the private market of affordable housing, right? Just buying it up. We saw it recently in York Region with in Aurora, where there's a 9-plex that was affordable. It wasn't affordable, when you looked at the rents, they just hadn't increased, so it was truly affordable. But what the realtor said, look, someone's going to buy this. They're going to pump a lot of money into it, evict the tenants, and those rents will no longer be affordable. So there's in a small town like Aurora, to lose 9 units of affordable housing is huge, right? And it happens all the time at that rate of 15 to 1. So that begs my next question, right? We're very positive on this podcast. We have big challenges, but let's talk about, if we're going to make our way out of this housing crisis, we need creativity, right? So can you talk to us a little bit about the trends and opportunities in creative mixed-use buildings that blend public, private, and nonprofit services?
So creative mixed-use buildings are in many ways a made in Greater Toronto solution. They are an approach to blending large-scale public, private, and nonprofit uses into the same building. And we've been doing these now in this region for many years. It's kind of flown under the radar. And I can give you a few examples that kind of make this very tangible. We have examples of, for example, North Toronto Collegiate Institute, which has a high school with 2 condominiums up above. We have examples with arts and culture facilities like Artscape, which has provided housing for artists in buildings on top of rec centers and other spaces. And I think the examples that are pushing the envelope in the social services, and I think in a really important direction, are projects like the Red Door Shelter, which is at Queen Street in Logan, and is a homeless shelter for women and families built into the side of an upscale condo with retail on the main floor. And that one is really quite a remarkable building to visit, because what you see is that actually the way that the building is, it's a lovely building, and the homeless shelter fits very seamlessly into that space and into that community. That was a building that the homeless shelter, just to give you a bit of the background there, the homeless shelter had been in an old church, and the church was going to sell because the congregation had dwindled. And so the homeless shelter, ideally at the time, wanted to buy the building and just stay in the church. And this will be familiar for many people who operate social services. The church building really wasn't fit for purpose. Like, it was not a nice place to provide services for people who were, fleeing situations of violence or needed emergency housing. And yet this organization was doing amazing work in that space. And their first initial desire would have been to just renovate, own the church outright, and stay in there. And for a variety of reasons, that wasn't viable. And they ended up having to do a partnership and ending up in a partnership with this private developer and with the city involved as a funding partner. And they've ended up with a space where the units are so much nicer and single units with their own washrooms, just like a brighter space, a newer space, and a space where they can now provide their services from. And so that's just an example of like this idea of the creative mixed use, that yes, there's a private development on that site. The homeless shelter is also very much on that site as well and providing service to their clients. And we're seeing that as well now with Eva's Phoenix at the Waterworks building downtown and a bunch of other projects. So this is an approach to city building that you recognize that our cities are growing and changing, and development and private development is going to happen. And you leverage some of the value so that the profit accrues, yes, some of it to the private sector, but a lot of it gets reinvested in the public and in the public interest and in affordable housing so that people have places to live.
It's very, very smart. And I hear what you're saying. I mean, it's much like when I think of Red Door, when it's not a purpose-built, that's not what it was built for, right? It was a church. It was built for that purpose, and you're trying to get that square peg into the round hole. It's really hard, but when you're building new, you get to think about all that. What are the uses now and into the future? It is purposely built for that use, much nicer. And the mix, too, was great. I'll give an example. In York region was Housing York actually did that. It wasn't private public, but what they did is they did 8 floors, I believe, of housing, and then behind that they put 360 kids in. They had a drop-in center, they had some apartments, they had emergency. So it wasn't the emergency housing site, it was a hub of activity, right? And when you first see the building, you see the apartments, and the way what they did with the apartments was really kind of neat too. Is they had 10 bands of income, so many apartments in this band, so many apartments in this, and so on. It was mostly for seniors, and the seniors and the youth have turned out to be a great mix, right? They just mix well. And when you drive by that, no one would ever know that's what it is and what the purpose is behind there. They weren't trying to hide anything, but it was just a brilliant mix, and it's used as a good example of being creative in how you do things. And they hadn't thought of that, but they did what you were saying, where they said, maybe we could bump this up 2 levels to put in this need if we're going to buy the land already. And so in thinking through that, I had never thought about this before with municipalities. You mentioned a lot of the places, but a lot of buildings owned by municipalities, because people think there's not a lot of land. We're landlocked in Toronto or York or wherever they are in Calgary. There might not be a lot of land. However, we never think of the airspace, so we don't think of fire stations that are 2 stories and EMS buildings, right? And that kind of thing. Is that a possibility in being creative, using some of that airspace?
You're thinking in exactly the same way as it has been on my mind. I mean, if you go around our city, you walk, you bicycle, you take public transit, you drive, I mean, you can see what a school looks like in this, in our communities. You can see what a community center, or arts and culture facility. Most of them are 2-story buildings, and if you're in a suburban area, they're surrounded by parking lots. There is, this idea that we're landlocked and don't have anywhere to build is, I think, is not factoring in all of the potential to be vertical. And our cities are already growing upwards, and developers have realized that that's the main way you can make a lot of money, is by upping the intensity and building a greater density. And I think, as for those of us who are focused on affordable housing and on the public realm, we can use those same tools and techniques, those same ideas of how density brings value, but capture that value and invest it in affordable housing, and ideally deeply affordable housing. So to give you some examples, we did a study recently on fire stations, exactly fire stations, saying, like, why does a fire station have to be a 2-story building surrounded by a parking lot? in the city of Toronto, there are over 100 fire stations and emergency service posts. So that's fire stations and ambulance posts. Could we integrate other uses on top of them? They've done this in Vancouver. They've done this in Calgary. They've done this in Washington, D.C. Why does a fire station have to be a 2-story building? And so we proposed a building that would have fire station on the first 2 floors with the hall for the firefighters, and then up above we could put affordable housing, and we could really build, depending on how dense it can go, depending on the site, you could build a lot of affordable housing just on top of fire stations. And then just think about what our rec centers or our libraries sites look like. I mean, there are so many sites in that are already publicly owned. That's the amazing part of this. You don't have to wrangle with developers. These are publicly owned, and many of them are transit corridors already. They're beautiful sites. To give you one other example, we also have been looking at private land holdings. So again, for people who say we're landlocked, think about what a grocery store typically looks like in this region. For many of the grocery stores are, again, a 1-story building, often a building that was built in the 50s or 60s, surrounded by acres of parking. We did a study that looked at six retailers, just 6 retailers, Loblaw, Sobeys, Metro, Canadian Tire, the beer store, and IKEA. And we did a calculation of how much housing could go just on their sites in Toronto. And we came up with 68,000 units just on their sites. And if even 10% of those were affordable housing, that's almost 7,000 units right there. So, we have to start thinking about city building differently and put affordability at the core and use the tools and techniques that developers have used over the years to be very successful themselves. Leverage those same techniques and tools so that the public can benefit and have spaces that are affordable.
Wow, that blows my mind. I love that, the 68,000 and when, because right now I think the province is saying, or CMHC, was saying we're about 3 million short across Canada. And of course people ask, like, well, where are we going to do that? But I think that was just grocery stores. You mentioned libraries, community facilities, fire halls, and all the different, again, that could happen fairly quick because the land's there, they're municipally owned. It's just amazing. So there are solutions, folks, that can happen fairly quick. We just have to be a little creative and think differently. And when we had Mark from Housing Now Toronto on, and he was brilliant. He said, come for a drive. I'll show you where we can do this. He said people are always amazed. I want to shift gears just a little bit, Matti, to talk about, I mentioned good policy, and I'm pretty sure I know the answer to this, but how much does good policy matter when it comes to infrastructure in a city?
It makes a huge difference. It makes a difference. So, I think of transportation policy. What type of transportation infrastructure are we investing in? Are we creating spaces for public transit to be connected with housing, for people to be able to walk safely and to cycle safely? So that's on the transportation side. The reason I start with transportation is because transportation is the other side of the housing coin. The housing and transportation are so tightly connected, and successful communities require great housing, and that housing needs to be connected with where people can get around, and ideally get around by transit, walking, and cycling. So that's on the transit side. Housing is the same thing. I mean, we have a series of exclusionary zoning policies that essentially make it almost impossible to build new housing in large swaths of our cities. And so, this is around things like laneway housing or infill housing or garden suites or fourplexes, all of the types of gentle intensification strategies that could really help make our communities a bit more intensive and create, again, spaces for people to live. There's also the rooming house policies. Rooming houses have historically played a really important role as a space where people can live affordably. And in this region, we've, in many communities, made it almost impossible by policy for people to live in those circumstances. Of course, we need policy to make sure that those rooming houses, for example, are safe and that they meet fire code. But we can do. But we've made it. And our response has been essentially to make it to outlaw them in much of the city. And so this is the space for policy. And people respond to policy, and they respond to also to incentives that are incentives and disincentives. And I think our system has been set up at the moment to be very car oriented, and in many cases to encourage development, either a tall type of development, right? So high rise, we call it tall and sprawl. You concentrate as much growth as you can in the nodes where you're able to build, or you sprawl around the periphery of the region, because again, that's a place that's easier to build as well. But that missing middle, that infill development, we've made it very hard, and that's making it difficult for people to live in the communities where they have connections and where they have all those networks and all that social capital built up.
Thanks for that. So let's talk about, when you think of examples of cities or communities that have implemented great policy, done some cool stuff with infrastructure and innovation. Who's doing this?
Yeah, there's a whole host of them, and I think of Minneapolis that ended single-family zoning. Helsinki is an example where they've brought transit and land use together, and then they've really pushed to end homelessness, and I think the ambition is critical. Bogota has this idea around care blocks, where they bring together all of their social services around spaces for care, which in a single block, and that can be walkable for people who live in that neighborhood. We often call them community hubs. We had a program in Ontario for community hubs for many years that I think had a hard time actually turning the ideas into action. So, there are other places that are doing it, but what I want to say too is, often in this region, my sense is we look elsewhere and we say, if only we could do what they do in Helsinki or in Stockholm or in London or in Bogota or in Portland or Vancouver, we would be able to get to a better place. And I think I think we should learn from others. I think also we can lead, and I think we shouldn't, the idea that we're number two, that someone else has done it first, and then we're going to run a pilot study for the next decade to really see what happens. That's kind of our impulse, and I think we can do so much better. I think we can be more ambitious, set goals that are high and that really meet the needs of our community, and then design the policy for ourselves. And I think for me, in the research I've been doing over the years, creative mixed use is really this example of a made in Toronto solution. We've studied 50 of these buildings in this region of mixes between public, private, and nonprofit that are, for all intents and purposes, you would almost never know they're there. And they're very local, and they're really brilliant solutions to local problems. And I think what we need to do is go from this creative mixed use as an example, being a last resort, to a first best option, and something that we do intentionally because it's the right thing to do. And I think it's the same with many of the strategies that you highlighted as well, that we often do them as one-offs, and we need to learn quickly from what has worked, and then we need to scale it up as fast as we can.
So you mentioned some of them, and I love what you're saying. Let's take Toronto as kind of the case study. What has to happen? And you mentioned some of the things that happen. What else has to happen for us to break through this housing crisis and end homelessness in a city like Toronto?
So one thing I think we should be clear on, and I'd be really interested in your view on this. I think we have two housing crises, actually. We have one for people who are employed and have incomes, and the housing prices for either rent or ownership has skyrocketed out of reach for many. And so many people are feeling who are employed and have quite significant incomes in many cases, don't feel like they can live in this city anymore and in this region anymore. So that's one aspect of the crisis. And then we have a crisis of people who are facing homelessness, where really it's a question much more about income, actually, and a question about the lack of income, and then overlay all sorts of other determinants of health, whether it's mental health or drug addiction or family trauma or other issues. And I think in some ways we sometimes lump all of those under one crisis, but we have to actually address them separately. And the idea of ending chronic homelessness is going to require a very focused effort, and one that focuses much more on providing this housing with the wraparound services, and recognizing that the private market alone is not going to address that part of the housing crisis, and adding supply is important for the first part of the housing crisis that I mentioned, to ideally to bring down prices for those who have an income and are looking for places to live. But in the second part of the crisis for homelessness, this is going to require a really sustained and focused intervention.
I like what you're saying. They are separate pieces. This is very complex, and unfortunately, many times, and I'm not pointing the fingers at politicians. You have so many things that are a focus, but you're looking for, give me one or two solutions. And we were talking about homelessness for years. The government was like, okay, and we got housing first. And they're like, I get housing first. So everything had to be housing first. But that's not the only piece. So now it's got housing first. It's the prevention. We get it. But there's multiple pieces to it. And I've got 4 years to get this done, guys. Maybe 5 if I'm lucky. And so my mandate can't go beyond that, but these are longer terms. Things like homelessness prevention takes a long time. Like, it's a lot of investment up front to pay off 10, 11 years later, where you're going to get massive results of people not falling, going into it, working upstream. However, many governments are like, I need to do something now, and I need the results now because I need to get reelected again. So some of the challenges too. You mentioned income. We just did a podcast with Grima from Matri. We're talking that the levels of Ontario Works of Welfare have not increased in Ontario, or are still below 1995 levels. 1995, there's a 21% cut. It has never come back from that, and you think how costs are up. So certainly there's the income piece. I think there's a reckoning too for how much we pay people as well, like a living wage of $24 an hour. And that, coincidentally, I mean, that's what you need to have a one-bedroom apartment, right? $24 to $28 an hour you should be making. But there's so many jobs, and good career jobs, right? Where we're going to lose people. If we look at healthcare and what's happening there, where right now a nurse is only making a couple dollars an hour more than a personal support worker. Now, listen, we love our personal support workers. We need them. But a nurse is going to school for 4+ years. It's just a different set of skills, right? And so we need to take a look at that. And opportunities for people when it used to be, well, the best way forward for income supports is a job. Not necessarily, right? With the types of jobs that are available to people. And we learned that the hard way at Blue Door. We said, okay, we've got to stop putting people in these precarious jobs that are not paying enough to lift them out of poverty and develop something. And we matched a need with the construction industry, who's going to build these houses, by the way. The trades desperately need people. They pay a fair wage. They always have, which is amazing. And it's meaningful work. And it's transferable work. And that lifts people out of poverty, right? So it is very complex in how we look at things. In the recent data that came out of the census was talking about the fastest growing housing structure, like a people, are roommates, people coming together. And then there was generation families, right? And I'm an example of that right now. We have our adult daughter and her husband are living with us. They both work. They both do well. It's just so unaffordable that, and their original plan was to move in and save up for a house, but as prices rose, and good for them, they realized, they said, ownership is not the way forward for us. But as long as you'll have us, we'll stay here, and it works for all of us. We love having them here too. But these are all the different things that are happening that are contributing. You're right. You have to kind of target specific pieces, and policies are different that affect each one of these things, right?
Yeah, I love how you describe even your household situation, because I mean, on one hand, I'm sure your daughter and family wants to have their own independence and feel like they've launched, and yet on the other hand, like, there is something nice about living in a multi-generational house and having family very close by. In a lot of cultures, that's like a really important part of their how they interact and how they raise family and engage with the grandparents. And my kids are quite a bit younger, but I think a lot about that, about where will they be and where will they be able to afford to live. And I think in some ways, if we want to be optimistic, I actually think some of the NIMBY sentiments, not my backyard sentiments, that have made it very difficult for development and infill in particular to happen in some of our Toronto neighborhoods is starting to subside. And part of it is because people are looking and saying, well, where are my children going to be? Like, I'm going to have to go across this entire city to be able to go and see them, or they're going to move out of town because they can't afford to live here. Like, it's some of this is altruism, and some of this is just like straight self-interest. And I think we're starting slowly to learn this. But you then see pitched battles. Like we studied a project that was a 7-story infill building on a main street, and it went through the planning process for 7 years. Like, and this was for a fairly upscale condo, and it took 7 years for this project to move for a 100-story, 100 unit 7-story building. And you're just like, if we're gonna take 7 years to approve every 100 unit building, I mean, it's just like we're gonna be in a real pickle. This is just gonna take. We're not gonna be able to make the progress we need. And instead, you're going to just get huge high-rises concentrated. The tall and sprawl pattern is going to persist. So I think we're starting to see attitudes change in this city that we're going to have to do something different, or the way that we've experienced and the experience that people my age have with our parents and our children's grandparents is not going to be the same for
the next said. Absolutely. You mentioned something, too, that I think we brought up on the podcast before. People have to realize. So when the federal government says we're going to put, this number of $1 billion into housing, and Adam Vaughn brought this before, it's like, listen, you need all 3 levels of government. And I was corrected, you actually need 4 by one of our Indigenous guests to say you need Indigenous people on those tables too. And I said, I stand corrected. So you need 4 because they all have to factor in. If you think, you can put the money in, but if the province then stalls it or isn't on the same wavelength, and then if your municipality planning departments are taking 7 years to approve it, that money just sits there, and they'll say, why was this money not spent out of this budget? Well, hey, that's beyond us. Like, there's certain things that are in everyone's purview, right? So you really need all 3 levels or 4 levels to get together, make it happen, and it's got to happen quick. And we saw probably the best example was rapid housing, right? Like if this Liberal government right now wants to point to what worked, rapid housing worked, right? And it takes a lot, but it can be done.
And I would even add to that, because I think, again, you talked about the political cycles, and the impulse is, 4 years, let's announce and let's get units built that I can then go on the political campaign trail and say, we built X thousand units. What about the operation and maintenance of those units? Like, it's, again, housing is like infrastructure. It's not a one-time expense. It has expenses year after year after year. And, you see this. You can defer for a year and maybe you don't see anything. You can defer for 2 years. Maybe it's still okay. But if you start to, over time, that adds up and the costs multiply. And it's what we were talking about before. You actually were losing units because we deferred maintenance for too long. And we've had some really tragic cases of like what happens when units actually fall into disrepair. Like, yes. I mean, wasn't it just recently, like the ceiling on a building collapsed? Like, that is tragic. That's heartbreaking. And it's such a like symbol of what happens when you don't invest enough. And so these announcements about the capital costs and these giant dollar figures are fantastic, and moving fast to build new housing is great, but it needs to be backed up by long-term sustained funding and a plan for operations and maintenance, or we're just going to end up in this same position just with even more housing.
And I think Toronto Community Housing got a bad rap, and that's not on them. That was poor planning, right, in the past, and then someone else is left holding the bag because you're years behind. And the feds did put some money into that infrastructure a while back, but that takes time. Once you have the money, now you have to get the contractors, work with the tenants, do that, and that could take years, right? So let's do it right from the beginning if we can to make sure. And you're right in thinking in the future, yes, it's great to get those all up, but we have to maintain them as well. Hey, listen, it's been such a pleasure talking with you. You're always doing great things. Anything exciting you're working on now that you want to share?
Yeah, we're starting. Thanks for that, Michael. We're starting a social purpose real estate accelerator at the Infrastructure Institute at the University of Toronto. We're working with community organizations, nonprofits, typically organizations that own land. We put out a call for organizations to come into this accelerator to really prototype and then hopefully move forward and accelerate redevelopment projects that bring this idea of social purpose real estate, the tools and techniques that the private sector has used, bring those forward and use and allow organizations, give them the skills and hopefully pair them with the networks and then ideally the capital down the road to really deliver on their own projects, whether it's a homeless shelter that is in an old building that thinks maybe they can redevelop and create a really bespoke space, or whether it's a food bank that maybe can have the food bank on the main floor and something up above, or a church that has a parking lot and might want to redo something on that parking lot. So we're really, in our case, trying to move from like an academics that put out ideas into the world to really trying to be part of the change and work with much more directly with organizations, to drive, to enable them to achieve their outcomes. And that part's really important. It's the organizations driving, and we can sort of support from behind and give all of the sort of underlying infrastructure, to use that word, that can help, the capacity and the networks that can help them really realize their
and I'm so glad you talked about this. We talked about this a little offline before we started, and I look at my organization. We have this crisis. We're trying to work through it. We have exactly what you're talking about, this land, and we're trying to develop real estate, but we have no idea where to start. This is not our background. Our background is in social services. We know this is a need. So the work that you're doing and bringing people together, not only are you giving us the tools to succeed, you're introducing us to other organizations that have, similar challenges and have creative ways of working through it that we all can share and duplicate. So thank you so much for that.
Oh, I appreciate it. Yeah, it's the community of practice idea, right? It's the idea that together when we learn from each other and can create these new ways of doing it. I mean, we were talking earlier about innovation, and I think this is how innovation happens: is when you bring together organizations and create a space where they can share and feel like they can learn from each other. And I think that's really what this accelerator program and some of the broader work we're doing. So I really appreciate that. And this has been an absolute pleasure.
I'm excited for the future. I'm excited for the work that you continue doing. I think I've learned so much during this podcast. Thank you for your leadership, the work you do, and I'm sure we'll have you back soon. If you ever have any of the super cool things you're working on you want to share with this sector, please reach out. In the meantime, enjoy your summer, and thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast.
Thanks, Michael.
Well, like I said, every time I have a guest on, I learn so much. And you hear me dropping some of those stats. Those are all from previous podcasts with experts that are out there, and they matter. And it all kind of comes together, whether we're talking about policy, infrastructure, we're talking about justice. Today, Matti said something again that I really hadn't. When you're talking about ending homelessness, you really have to factor in transportation. We don't talk about that in the sector, right? That's just an add-on, but it should be. And actually think about that in York region, our good friends at the Region of York and Housing York, they do think about that. Every new building that they put out with social housing has been on a major transit route. And 30 years ago, when Blue Door, where we are now in East Gwillimbury, that was built, that was not a consideration. It was, hey, let's get them out of a neighborhood where NIMBYism won't happen, right? But they're doing it right now, and it shows that people can get to their groceries, and people can get to see their families, and people can be a community. So cool. Learning so much. Every week, I guarantee, with our guests, you'll learn something new that can help us work our way forward. Until then, we will see you next time on The Way Home.